understanding the roots of the Ukraine war, Crimea, and the Syrian crisis. There's so much in the news right now, more crisis in Syria. Since all the problems went away, apparently, now we've got more problems than we ever had before. And of course, Crimea, you're seeing that's in the news a lot. The Ukraine war, which just doesn't seem to want to stop. But do people understand the roots? 1 Corinthians 10 verse 6 says, now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things, as they also lusted. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition. There's a lot we can learn from history. In fact, you can't understand what's going on today if you don't understand the historical roots. And Ukraine does have a long history. And it's tragic how many people are dying. You can't believe how many lives have been lost in this terrible war in Ukraine. In fact, I've seen reports that the death toll so far could be well over 1 million people have died in the Ukraine war in the last 3 years. Totally avoidable. As Donald Trump said, if he had been president, if the election had not been stolen in 2020 in that unbelievable manipulative piece of nonsense where they had a record number of ballots from mail-in ballots, then this war wouldn't have happened. And just think how many lives were lost because of the manipulation of the media, the lying, the distortion, the fraud involved in just one election, but there's so many others too. The cemeteries in Ukraine are just expanding, and it's beyond shocking how many unnecessary deaths. But it's not just people who die in war. The first casualty in war is truth. And just take this news item I saw yesterday. This is the size of territory stolen by Russia. How's that for objective reporting? That Ukraine is expected to give up in exchange for peace. Now, President Donald Trump has told Zelensky that he's got to accept Crimea is Russian and the Donbass is Russian, and that's it. So now they're saying this territory is of the same size as the one Ukraine is expected to surrender to the enemy. Now, this is meant to be news. Now, that territory that pointed out, by the way, you could say that was stolen from Great Britain. All those 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard of America, that was stolen by America from Britain. And that's what Americans celebrate on the 4th of July. So again, all the different news reports, you can hear things like, you know, he was cowering in the bunker, or he was hiding in the bunker, or he was sheltering from the bombardment in the bunker. You know, it makes a big difference which way you put it. And you can so prejudice reporting with the language chosen. But we're told in Ephesians 4:25, therefore, having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor. Wouldn't that be a nice change if the media actually tried to speak truth? As for the politicians, well, that's something else. Well, look at this language map. As a missionary, we always encourage to look at countries as ethno-linguistic people groups to reach. Now, it just so happens the whole eastern part of Ukraine is majority Russian-speaking. So that's a significant piece of information, where here they're saying, you know, this is the land stolen by Russia. Is it stolen by Russia, or was it Russian in the first place? Well, have a look at this historical map. The blue territory in the middle is what Ukraine was in 1654. Since 1654, the light green to the north is what was added by the Russian Tsars. And then the Donbass, this whole region, eastern Ukraine, that was what Lenin added to Ukraine for administrative purposes, even though it was always Russian. Stalin added 1939, 1945, Moldova areas that they stole from Hungary and from Romania. And then the red is Crimea, which was added to Ukraine without a referendum, arbitrarily by a Ukrainian dictator of the Soviet Union, Khrushchev. So Khrushchev, 1954, just arbitrarily handed this territory, which was 99% Russian, over to Ukraine. And nobody could argue because he was a dictator of the Soviet Union and he was Ukrainian himself. So that's pretty significant if you just look at some of the facts. So, you know, stolen by Russia is actually not the full story, and you need to bear in mind what happened beforehand too. America sponsored a coup d'etat in 2014, and then the first thing these characters did was they banned Russian as a medium of education. And so the Russian section, the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, the part that had been added by Lenin, they decided to secede, and they got bombed and attacked by the Ukraine Army and Air Force, shelled and so on, rocketed, massacred by the thousands from 1914 onwards. And now that's a section that Russia's come in to reclaim and to protect after they had referendums and chose to secede and wanted to rejoin with Russia. So the situation is not as simple as the media is trying to put out. If you want to understand something of Ukraine's history, there's a very good dramatic film came out a few years ago called Bitter Harvest. It's a dramatic film that's got hope. It doesn't just expose the horrors of the Holodomor and of the Soviet Union, but it's got resistance. It's a very good pro-Ukrainian film to understand history from Ukraine's perspective. And they've been betrayed horribly by the West and, of course, abused by the Soviets horribly. And it's good to understand Ukraine's history. But we also need to understand the meddling in foreign countries by the US State Department, the CIA, and USAID. Notice on the left, you can see these countries before liberation, and on the right, the improvements made by USAID. You know, riots and revolutions can always improve a country, can't they? Like Syria, before and after. You can see the improvement made by billions and billions of dollars of USAID money. And Syria before US democracy and Syria after. See the improvement, much better. Just like we can see in South Africa, the great improvement from before 94 and after US intervention in the ANC. Now, we've got Vladimir Zelensky in South Africa right now. He's apparently bought a uranium mine for only $1.2 billion. Makes you wonder where he got that money from, probably not legitimately. And buying a mine in South Africa that could be used for nuclear weapons, for that matter. Uranium mine. And I thought that Cyril Ramaphosa represented a country that was in alliance with Russia, but now here he is consorting with Russia's enemy. Now, Zelensky is meant to be a great fighter for freedom, the Winston Churchill of our age, they say. He's banned all political parties except his own. He hasn't allowed any elections. His election term ran out a few years ago. So he's just waived elections as unnecessary at the moment. He's banned all media except for the state-controlled media. So journalists have been arrested, politicians have been arrested, and he's banned the biggest denomination, church denomination in Ukraine, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, which most of the people belong to, locked up priests, beaten up priests, taken over buildings, closed buildings, padlocked doors. So here's a leader of democracy who has crushed religious freedom, crushed journalistic freedom, crushed political freedom, refuses to hold elections, but he's the leader of freedom and democracy. It reminds me of the Second World War, when nobody elected Winston Churchill. He caused the chaos with the disastrous Norwegian campaign, which led to the resignation of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, and nobody else wanted to take England at that time when they were losing on the battlefronts on all sides, and Churchill was the only one willing to take the job of Prime Minister, but he wasn't elected to it. And in South Africa, our Prime Minister, the highly popular James Barry Hertzog, he was refusing to declare war on Germany, saying, this has nothing to do with us, it's nothing even to do with Britain, it's an internal problem between Germany and Poland on their frontier, it's got nothing to do with Britain, we're not going to declare war. So Jan Smuts did a coup d'etat, removed our elected Prime Minister who had beaten Smuts 5 times in a row in elections. And Smuts became leader without an election. Did you know South Africa had a coup? 1939. No referendum, no elections, just the general takes over and he becomes the Prime Minister of South Africa. And the first thing he does, he takes all of the gold in South Africa and ships him to Simonstown secretly to be secretly loaded onto an American battleship, the USS Quincy, to be shipped to New York. And once it arrived there, it released Lend-Lease. And the United States suddenly starts in billions upon billions of dollars of high-tech weaponry to the Soviet Union, thanks to South African gold. And so, that's the democracies. Nobody elected Stalin, nobody elected Churchill, nobody elected Jan Smuts, but they were leading the democracies. And then the dictators happened to have been elected, funnily enough. But, this is just the way the terminology goes. So Zelensky's the freedom fighter fighting for democracy, except he locks up his opposition, bans the media, and closes churches. Well, if you want to know why things are as they are, Ukrainian officials have released the stats of how much money they've been giving to politicians in America. And the FBI has released this, that Joe Biden got $92 million from Ukraine. Do you think that could have colored some of his policies and his voting patterns? Elizabeth Cheney got $77 million. Mitt Romney, $71 million. Lindsey Graham, $82 million. No wonder he is so hawkish. Such a rhino. Mitch McConnell, $89 million. So you look at all this and you think, politicians, poly-ticks. Poly, mini, ticks, blood-sucking parasites. Poly-ticks, mini, blood-sucking parasites. So Obama funded large amounts of money, as we can see that through USAID put multiplied millions of dollars into promoting LGBTQ activists in every country in Africa, and even in Red Square in Moscow, outside the Kremlin. That'll irritate someone. And a coup d'etat, of course, in Kiev, in Ukraine. And of course, the people over in Eastern Europe are going to be fed up with this interfering in their internal affairs and gay gendering, transgendering their kids, propaganda, grooming of their kids. And so there's a campaign of hate Russia and gay propaganda documentary produced showing how they mobilized the whole anti-Russia, Russia campaign. Now, interesting, these are the same people who were pro-Russia when they were communist, when it was the Soviet Union. But now that Russia's moving away from communism and advocating pro-life, pro-family agendas, now suddenly they hated Russia. And Vladimir Putin, who has been rebuilding churches as by way of compensation, restitution for the years and years and years of the Soviet Union destroying churches, they hate him now. They don't hate Putin because he used to be KGB and used to be communist. They hate him because he's now pro-Christian. And so Barack Obama set up a series of provocative, threatening events like a row of dominoes, so as to be able to accuse Russia of aggression. You get these kids at school, he hit me. Yeah, well, you hit me first. And now, well, what's the agenda? Okay, what did you do before he hit you? Well, teasing, pushing, tripping, whatever. Well, no wonder he hit you back. I would hit you back too. And the two sides to every story is being ignored. The Russian military aggression could then be used to restart the Cold War and justify American military intervention in Ukraine as a pretext for plundering it. And that's not an exaggeration. This initiated a campaign of mafia-like piracy, a protection racket on a national scale. This was headed by Joe Biden as the godfather of this Biden crime syndicate, and his son Hunter served as his in-country enforcer. And you've had headlines like this on One American News. Hunter Biden earned $156 million from Ukraine corruption in fields he was not trained in, had no expertise in, but he was paid millions, even for his stupid paintings, which, honestly, my grandson could have done a better job, and so on. So Hunter Biden joined the board of Burisma Holdings, a Ukrainian natural gas company, in 2014. And then Mykola Zolchevsky, the owner of Burisma Holdings, was under investigation for channeling government contracts to his business while he was the Minister of Ecology, whatever that is, in 2010 to 2012. So then in comes Victor Schlopin, the Prosecutor General, and Trump supporters say Joe Biden forced Kiev to sack him or lose American aid because Shokin was investigating Burisma, which Hunter Biden was on the board of, getting millions for not doing anything, actually. And You can actually see the video online where, in a speech to the Council on Foreign Relations, Biden boasted that he went to Kiev while he was vice president under Obama and said, "You're not getting the $1 billion until the prosecutor's fired. I'm leaving in 6 hours. If the prosecutor's not fired, you're not getting the money." And he boasted of this. And so he interfered in the government. They fired the prosecutor who was investigating, amongst other things, his son Hunter. I mean, conflicts of interest, possibly? And so, yes, you had this. In 2020, the Operation Destroy Trump was a media campaign to keep this crime syndicate going. Because somewhere along the line, Trump was going to stumble over this corruption that was on the go. And so Biden had to get back in. And so that explains the huge amounts of media smokescreen. Impeach Trump, hold Trump accountable. You know, worst Trump scandal ever, Trump collusion, Ukraine gate, investigate Trump. Trump is not above the law. And they were carrying on and on about this and saying that he was involved in some kind of collusion with Russia. Meanwhile, the Biden family and other members of Congress were raking multiplied millions out of the Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe, one of the most corrupt countries in the world. And it was one big, massive scam. 2 Peter 2:19 declares, while they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption. You would not be too surprised by now to know how many people who scream freedom are actually using it as a cover for corruption. And that's why we read in Galatians 6:7, do not be deceived. God cannot be mocked. A man reaps what he sows. And it's coming. 2 Chronicles 19 verse 2 declares, should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord? Therefore the wrath of the Lord is upon you. I mean, these people are just amongst some of the corrupt characters who are loving that which God hates and hating that which God loves. So in 2014, Ukraine had a government that was elected and which had laws against homosexual grooming of children. So the USAID put $5 billion, $5 billion with a B, into creating radio, TV stations, newspapers, magazines, a whole social media network, which worked to disrupt the whole country and overthrow the elected government. 2014, you might recall all that. And much better, the Mayan Square. Thanks to America putting $5 billion into regime change, to quote them, in Ukraine. And as a direct response of the Obama-sponsored Orange Revolution or Mayan Revolution coup, 2014, the government comes in immediately. They canceled the minority rights or language rights of Russians in the eastern Donbass region. And that led to the people who are overwhelmingly Russian, who should have been Russia, and the only reason they were in Ukraine was because of this arbitrary decision made by Vladimir Lenin years ago. And why should they want to be part of that? There was a referendum in Crimea. They decided to secede and rejoin Russia. And the Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk, they also had referendums and decided to leave. And so these regions had overwhelming Russian majority, like in Donetsk. And these are some of the most mineral-rich parts of Russia. These rare earth minerals that they are offering to America are actually in the sections that are Russian and which have joined Russia. And Luhansk, they declared independence from Ukraine, and then they were attacked. They were rocketed, bombed, strafed. When people talk about the war starting 3 years ago, 2022, that's false. That's a propaganda narrative. The war started in 2014 with the American-sponsored coup d'etat, and then Ukraine declaring war on these Russian areas, first of all, abolishing their language rights, and then shelling, rocketing, and bombing them, killing 14,000 civilians before the Russians came in. So when you've heard this ongoing refrain, this mantra, Putin, without any provocation, unprovoked aggression, well, that's not true. To say that Russia invaded Ukraine is accurate. To say it was unprovoked is complete fraud. And yet you've got to keep saying unprovoked. And by the way, you might have noticed sometimes there were discussions on TV, like in Australia, and somebody says, but the war started in 2014, and then they chased out of the studio instantly, off the board, not allowed to speak. Universities and so on. you couldn't mention 2014. 2014 is not relevant. It's like, he hit me. You're not allowed to say, but he hit me first. And this is what we need to understand, the roots of the conflict right now. This triggered the civil war, which led to the first ceasefire in August 2014. And these were some of the adverts out there: save the Donbass people from the Ukraine army, because the Ukraine army was shelling apartment blocks. They're murdering civilians, rockets. Here's Ukrainian separatists from the Donbass with Ukrainian aggressors, prisoners of war being brought through their towns. And notice their flags look awfully like the Russian flag. That's because they are Russian. And you can see their sentiment. This is the Donbass region, Donetsk and Luhansk. And so this is already 2014. The civil war did not start in 2022, it started in 2014. So that's the first thing to realize. And the boundaries of Lugansk and Donetsk was recognized by the Treaty of Minsk. You might have heard of the Minsk Agreement already in 2015. And when Biden rejected Russia's demand for a promise that Ukraine would not become a base for anti-Russian nuclear missiles, Biden refused to give that guarantee. And as late as February 2022, Vladimir Putin was asking for an urgent meeting with Biden to discuss the situation in Ukraine, to avoid a war. Biden refused to respond, and so Russia's unprovoked aggression started late February 2022. Of course, it was heavily provoked. But Putin's predictable decision was to formally recognize Donetsk and Luhansk as independent countries. I mean, they were Russian-speaking, Russian culture, Russian ethnic demographics. It was Russian, and the only reason it was part of Ukraine is because Lenin just arbitrarily put it in the Ukraine administrative area without any demographic or historical, cultural reason to do so. And then he entered into mutual defense agreements with these two states. And from the Russian perspective, this justified their military incursion into these two states, including to assault Ukrainian airports, weapons, and military infrastructure, which was being used to attack their allies, which had now seceded from Ukraine. So geographically, Donetsk borders Russia, and it's got a stretch of coastline on the Sea of Azov. You've heard of the Azov Battalion. That's another story. And they're also close to Crimea, and therefore part of the supply line to support Crimea. Luhansk is immediately north of Donetsk and also borders Russia. So these two states now formed a friendly buffer zone for Russia between itself and the US, EU-controlled Ukraine, which now we know it's been a proxy war from the beginning. The Americans and the British have had their people in there, even operating the missiles, actually targeting cities and civilians inside Russia. They've had vast amounts of biological warfare laboratories all over Ukraine. And there's been so much evidence that every target, everything they were doing was being planned by NATO commanders. EU and American, British officers were making the decisions right from the beginning. It was a proxy war. The Ukrainians were being told what to do, what to target, where to fire, not just being provided with the ammunition, but the US technicians were in Ukraine waging the war from the beginning. And so one should also remember that there's a lot of Christians in Ukraine and a lot of Christians in Russia. This is in commemoration of Prince Vladimir, who got converted back in 988 and ordered all the people of Russia to be baptized. And these are obviously post-Soviet era time monuments. These are recent monuments that are going up commemorating their Christian heritage. It's kind of hard to miss that it's not the Hammond sickle now going all over the place, it's the cross. So the war in Ukraine was actually planned as part of the Great Collapse before the Great Reset. All part of the whole, remember 2020, lockdown, lunacy, masquerade madness, salvation by vaccination, COVID cult. Well, that was meant to be part of the Great Collapse because that was collapsing economies, many people's businesses. We all suffered from it. And churches were closed all over the world. Well, to further understand the war in Ukraine and the atrocities in Syria and Crimea, we need to understand the Turkish genocide of the Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek Christians. 2025 marks the 110th anniversary of the launch of the systematic extermination of Christian Armenians by the Ottoman Turks. And before someone gets confused, we're not talking about the Armenians in doctrine, we're talking about the Armenian people. Armenian with an I is a doctrine named after Arminius, whereas the Armenians with an E, it's the oldest Christian kingdom on earth. Dates back to the 1st century, they were being converted to Christ. Now this jihad began with the arrest of 250 Christian leaders in Constantinople, what today is called Istanbul, on Easter Sunday, 24th of April, 1915. 800 Christian leaders were arrested countrywide that same day, that's Easter Sunday. And 1.5 million Christians were slaughtered by the Muslims in Turkey during 1915. Additionally, 750,000 Assyrian Christians and 950,000 Greek Orthodox Christians were also murdered in the Ottoman Turkish Empire between 1915 and 1922. This amounts to 3.5 million Christian victims of the Turkish Empire in just over 7 years, if you add in the other 100,000 Maronite Christians too. So April 24th, 1915 is known as the first event of the Armenian genocide, or the Turkish genocide of the Armenians, as I prefer to call it. And just to put some faces, these are some of the leaders that were the ones first rounded up in Constantinople, which was decapitate the leadership of the Armenians before rounding them up. And the word genocide dates back to 1915, which was a word that wasn't in the dictionary before 1915. It's specifically the word genocide. Some people think it belongs to only the Second World War. No, it in fact started in 1915 as the deliberate extermination of a people or nation and their heritage, which was designed by the Turks in 1915. They thought the world was distracted by the First World War and they could get away with it and no one would notice. From the 15th century, the dominant Muslim power was the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which oppressed millions of Christians, including Armenians and Greeks and many Slavs, because at one time they controlled Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe. Hungary, Bulgaria, Romania were all under them. Even the Crimea was actually under the Turks at that time. The Ottoman Turkish Empire was the biggest threat the church had ever faced to that date. When the greatest city in the world at that time, Constantinople, fell to the Turks in 1453, and they massacred the entire Christian population of the city, the Christian Byzantine Empire, which had stood for 1,000 years, fell. Notice this picture. This is an Arab portrait of King Mohammed the Magnificent standing, seated on his horse. But what's his horse standing over? They could have put anything in their drawing. They could have put a Christian knight. They could have put the last king, Constantine the 13th of the Byzantine Empire. No, they put a Christian princess, a woman in white gown with a crown on her head. So it's a Christian princess, obviously a non-combatant, not in armor or anything like this. That's what they depicted, just to show their contempt for women, their contempt for civilians. This is their propaganda portrait in the gates of the city, showing trampling on civilians, in this case, a female princess, blonde hair obvious there. And this is the kind of attitude, this is their propaganda picture. It's not something Christians drew of it. And they massacred 12,000 people just in San Sophie. That's the largest church in the world. And when Barack Hussein Obama, as American president, visited Constantinople, Istanbul, I should say, during his presidency, he walked around San Sophie praising the advanced Islamic architecture, which was built in the 4th century pre-Islam. It's Orthodox Coptic Byzantine architecture. And it's a site for the biggest massacre of Christians in a church building ever. 12,000 Christians, mostly women and children, killed in that church. And that no journalist even reported on this oversight and stupidity and ignorance of Barack Obama. Well, it's hard to believe he's that ignorant. He just kind of ignored. I mean, who cares about 12,000 Christians? I mean, what's that? So what? And he was able to get away with it. Could you imagine Donald Trump getting away with something similar? You know, say a site where maybe Christians had murdered Muslims. Not that I can think of an equivalent situation where that ever happened, but imagine he would have been crucified in the media for some slight like that. But no, Barack Hussein Obama, he's just got a free pass. The Turks sacked Budapest, taking hundreds of thousands of Christians into Islamic slavery from the very heart of Europe. You wonder why Hungary doesn't want Muslim migrants today. They know that demographics is destiny. The Ottoman Empire declined into corruption and degeneracy from the very beginning. Now notice, at one time they controlled a good part of Algeria and Libya, Egypt, all the way through Palestine, Iraq, Syria. All of these areas were under the Ottoman Turks, and this explains some of what's going on in Syria to this day. Even the Crimea was part of the Ottoman Empire at one point. You can see here the Khanate of the Crimea. That was all part of Turkey at that stage. And so much of the problems going on in Syria today dates back to the Ottoman Empire. Catherine the Great of Russia liberated the Crimea from the Turks back in the 1700s. Russia has owned Crimea longer than America has had Hawaii or Alaska. And it's just amazing that anyone can talk about, Russia stole Crimea. No, they didn't. Crimea, if anything, was stolen by Khrushchev to make it part of Ukraine. Crimea has historically never been part of Ukraine. Demographically, it's always been Russian. Linguistically, it's always been Russian. It's got the Russian fleet. It's, in fact, Russia's only ice-free port is on the Black Sea in Sevastopol. And there's no way America's ever going to give up their Pearl Harbor or something like that. And there's no way that the Russians are going to give up Sevastopol and the Crimea. Crimea is not Ukrainian. It's never been Ukrainian. And so this business of they've got to give back Crimea, Crimea has been stolen from us, that's just from ahistoric imbeciles who know nothing about history. It's propaganda, nothing else. Crimea is essential to Russian security, and they've thought that for years, and that's why Donald Trump sees this, and he said to Zelensky, forget Crimea. You didn't argue about it in 2014 when Crimea had a secession. They went through the referendum and so on. You can't start claiming Crimea is yours now. You didn't do anything about it in 2014. You didn't do anything about it for the next 15 years. Why should you now suddenly think you've got the right to Crimea? And Crimea has absolutely essential naval bases, and the Russians are very attached to their Crimean base, and the Crimeans are very attached to Russia. It's like when the Argentinians invaded Falklands and said, this is the Malvinas, this is going to belong to Argentine. And the British said no. Falklands are very important to them, but the Falklanders wanted Britain to control it too. The Falkland inhabitants were even more pro-British than the British were pro-Falklands. And today they've renamed one of their towns, I think, Margaret Thatcher, after the British Prime Minister, the Iron Lady, for liberating them. And they did see themselves as liberated. The Argentinians came in and were very bombastic, and everyone's going to drive on the right-hand side of the road now, no more driving left, and they just changed everything around, and they oppressed the people, renamed things, and the Falklanders were completely pro-British. They didn't want to be part of Argentina, they wanted to be part of the British area. The people in Sevastopol, in the Crimea, are very pro-Russian. Notice the Russian Navy's flag today is not the old Hammond sickle and red flag, it's now the St. Andrew's Cross. And the Russians are invested in Crimea. They have established themselves in Sevastopol. They're not going to move. Now back to Turkey. When Sultan Muhammad III died in AD 1595, his son Muhammad had his 19 brothers murdered. Imagine someone who can murder 19 of his brothers to prevent them from claiming his throne. So these people are very corrupt from the beginning. He had 7 of his father's pregnant concubines sewn into sacks and thrown into the river. So the Ottoman Empire didn't get degenerate later, they were degenerate from the beginning. Many of his nephews were incarcerated in the cage, and Sultan Ibrahim threw his Grand Vizier into a cistern to drown, which is, polluting the water too, not acceptable. The Ottoman ruler at the time, Sultan Ibrahim I, was emotionally unstable and believed to be mad. Well, I think we've had our share of mad kings and mad presidents, and we've got them today as well. One morning after an orgy, Ibrahim had all 300 women of his harem put into sacks, thrown to Bosphorus to drown. You can't swim if you're in a sack. Only one survived by being picked up by a ship bound for France. When Ibrahim was finally assassinated, which is the main way they changed their leaders there, you don't exactly have the ballot box, so you've got to use the dagger. The Ottoman Empire was torn apart by more corruption, more nepotism, more inefficiency, misrule, and power struggles. And in the early 19th century, after the Ottoman Empire suffered defeats at the hands of Russia and Austria, the Greeks and the Serbs mounted successful wars of national liberation because they were colonies oppressed by the Turks at that stage, were part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire. Which, by the way, explains why so much of the Acropolis is in ruins. You wonder how, the years and the winds didn't erode away these great temples. The Turks stood afar off with their cannons, and they fired cannonballs to wreck so much of these ancient Greek architecture, or they'd still be standing there. It was deliberate sabotage of a lot of the Greek heritage. The Greek sacred band fought the Turks in Romania as well, and Sultan Muhammad II decided to massacre all the Janissaries. Now, the Janissaries were the elite troops of the Turks, but they were all recruited from Christian families, so they were expendable. They were the best troops. From age 6 to 8, they would come, and it was called the blood tax. 1 of every 5 Christian boys would be taken to serve in the Janissaries. They had brutal training, and they knew nothing of love. They only knew brutality and severity and strictness. But this is how they built up their elite troops, because Christians didn't matter. They could put them in the front line of any attack, and if they all got killed, it didn't matter because they were all expendable, they were all Christians. And of course, they were forced to be Muslims, but they came from Christian backgrounds. So that's why the Janissaries were considered expendable. But now, with so much turning against the Sultan, he wondered if his elite troops might turn against him. So he decided to preemptively murder them all. The reforms and the westernization of the state institutions of Turkey was accompanied by escalating persecution of Christians. So to pander to the West, they would adopt Western constitutions and things like this to placate the European powers, but to placate their own people who were unhappy about that, they let them murder more Christians. And that was a way of, please the West with Western-type constitutions and structures, and please their supporter base by letting them murder more Christians. And the 19th century saw the most thorough, complete destruction of Christian communities throughout the Middle East, Asia Minor, and the Caucasus and the Balkans, which, remember, is the heartland of the church. This is where the church started. That's Damascus, Syria. This is the Christians who had survived for centuries, for over a millennium, now start to get wiped out in the 19th century under the noses of the Western powers who were well aware what was happening, and they were pushing them to westernize, to modernize their constitutions, while they gave them modern weapons and artillery, mind you. So just for an example, to show you what led to what we're dealing with now. In 1822, the entire population of the island of Chios, tens of thousands of people were massacred or enslaved by the Turks. In 1823, 8,750 Christians were slaughtered by the Turks at Mussolini. And in Mosul, in 1850, thousands of Assyrian Christians were murdered. Then comes the Crimean War, which is so important for us to understand what we're dealing with today with the Crimea. Because most people don't know anything about Crimea except maybe the Crimean War. A famous war, one of the first wars to be covered with photography, and of course it's famous for Florence Nightingale, and it's super famous for the Charge of the Light Brigade. Many of us have heard of the Charge of the Light Brigade, one of the most disastrous military actions ever. Courageous, yes, but disastrous. And Alfred Lord Tennyson wrote the poem, The Charge of the Light Brigade, in 1854. Half a league, half a league, half a league onwards, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why. theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode, and well. Into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell rode the 600. Flashed all their sabres bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabring the gunners there, charging an army, while all the world wandered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke. Cossack and Russian reeled from the sabre stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon behind them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell. All that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made. All the world wondered. Honor the charge they made. Honor the Light Brigade. Noble 600. Now, Alfred Tennyson's poem was published on 9th of December, 1854 in the Examiner, and it went on to be glorified in many a play, inspired by the terms of Psalm 23, of the Valley of the Shadow of Death. It highlights one of the most famous events of this long, costly, disastrous Crimean War. The Light Brigade had been ordered into a nearly hopeless situation. And due to command confusion, to put it nicely, and incompetence, they lost the cream of Europe's cavalry. Yet incredibly, they did succeed. They reached the Russian artillery at the end of a long valley lined with artillery on both sides, and they actually succeeded in fighting their way out of this Russian trap. An astounding achievement. Most of the men actually made it back to their own lines, which is phenomenal. I mean, how could they have done it? Now, there were actually 666 men, but that's a bit of a mouthful in the poem, so just abbreviate to 600. There have been a number of films made of that, and maybe you've seen the very glamorized Errol Flynn and Olivia de Havilland version. This one is quite imaginative, not very historical, but rip-roaring and sort of has you cheering. Then, 1960s, they produced a far more somber, cynical, skeptical, anti-war version. This is in the time of the Vietnam War, and so this was a very negative portrayal of the Charged Light Brigade, probably a lot more realistic, though. And for centuries, Russian statesmen saw their manifest destiny to defend Orthodox Christianity against Islamic jihad and against Roman Catholicism, which was seen as treacherous. I mean, they'd betrayed them how many times. Systematically, Russia had worked at freeing Christians from the Ottoman Turkish control, liberating the Balkans, forcing the Turks to respect religious freedom of their Christian subjects. And as Russia extended Christian civilization over the whole of North Asia to the Pacific Ocean, which was a phenomenal achievement, they were also pushing southward in their civilizing mission, seeking to liberate the holy place of Palestine, in which was then controlled by the Muslim Turks. Now, amazing, Americans feel very positive about their manifest destiny as they civilized North America and achieved civilization over the Indians. Well, the Russians had a much tougher manifest destiny fighting Asian hordes, which were far more advanced in terms of their military techniques. And what the Russians achieved was no less noble and in many cases a greater achievement than what the American pioneers did in civilizing the whole of North America. If it hadn't been for the untimely intervention of Great Britain and France, the Russians would have undoubtedly overrun the whole rotten, corrupt, crumbling edifice of the Turkish Empire, and they would have established Orthodox Christianity throughout the Middle East, but for the Crimean War. Britain dreaded the establishment of a Russian superpower stretching from the Arctic to the Indian Ocean. And so to prevent Christian Russia from gaining ice-free ports for their navy, Britain became the protector and the guarantor of the Muslim Ottoman Turkish Empire, probably the greatest enemy Christianity has ever faced to that date. Thousands of Assyrian Christians were murdered in the province of Mosul in 1850. Photography is coming out, so now we've got some disturbing pictures. It was atrocities like these that led the Russians to demand the right to protect the holy places, which were under Orthodox supervision in the Middle East, especially in the Holy Land. And the status quo was destabilized in 1852 with the accession to power in France of Napoleon III. And in order to increase his prestige, he sought to provoke an international crisis by demanding that the Turks place the holy places in the Middle East under the power of the Roman Catholic Church rather than the Eastern Orthodox Church. And this was a very cynical move because Napoleon III's French regime was completely secular. So this is a manipulative diplomatic move designed to provoke a war with Russia. But with a name like Napoleon, he needed to have wars, he needed to extend his empire, and so this is just cynical politics. So Napoleon III's France assumed the role of Catholic crusader, although this is not in aid of the cross, this is in aid of the crescent, this is in aid of Islam. Effectively, he's supporting the blood-stained, despotic, corrupt Ottoman Turkish Empire. And this move by Napoleon III led to the soaking of the continent in blood. And sadly, the British participated as allies in this. Over 800,000 people died in the Crimean War, which is less than the amount who've died now in the Ukrainian war in just the last few years. Far more serious than actual loss in lives and limbs was the British and French actions in the Crimean War extended the worthless existence of the Turkish tyranny. And they targeted the Christians more afterwards, who had previously been under protection of Tsarist Russia. And so with greater ferocity, they took out their frustration, being a dying, decaying, decrepit empire. They took it out on the Christians. In 1860, over 12,000 Christians were slaughtered in Lebanon. And that's one of the problems why right now, you know, even in my lifetime, Christians were still a majority in Lebanon, 60%. But they've tipped it now. Now the Christians are the minority in Lebanon. And as the Christians have gotten either murdered or fled, Lebanon has become majority Muslim, and it's just degenerated into worse and worse a situation. But it all started with Napoleon III's alliance to save the Ottoman Turkish Empire. In 1876, 14,700 Bulgarians were murdered by the Turks. At the town of Bateo, out of 7,000 inhabitants, 5,000 Christians were put to the sword. In 1881, the Turks slaughtered the Christians in Alexandria. Remember, Alexandria is one of the greatest cities in the world at that time. It was a city of knowledge and study, a university city founded by Alexander the Great himself. Once had one of the greatest libraries in the world, burned out by the Turks after they took Alexandria. Now, the reports of these and other atrocities were routinely suppressed by the British government of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, the first Jew to be a Prime Minister of Britain. Now they've got the first atheist Marxist in Britain as Prime Minister. They just went through a Hindu as Prime Minister. So what's going on with Britain that they can't have Christian Prime Ministers now? Well, Disraeli promoted an alliance with a Muslim Turkey against Christian Russia. Gladstone described the British alliance with Turkey as the scandalous alliance. It was a scandal. Now it doesn't surprise people to see Christian countries in Europe in alliance with Muslim countries, but back then they still had some standards, and it was a scandal throughout Christendom that Britain could be in alliance with Turkey. Gladstone opposed the Turkophile policies of Disraeli in these words: "He's not such a Turk as I thought. What he hates is Christian liberty and reconstruction." What Gladstone observed 170 years ago could easily be applied to the foreign policies of many Western governments today. Just think of the policies of Great Britain or Macron's France right now, or Biden's America before Donald Trump liberated him. The Islamophilia in the West is not so much a love of Islam, but a hatred of Christianity. Have you noticed these feminists who love Islam? Well, what will the Muslims do with feminists if they get power? What will the Paris fashion parades look like? You know, walk around with the burqa, the latest fashion this year, and so on. And then the homosexuals, what do they think that Muslims are going to do with them? If Sharia law comes to Afghanistan, what do you think is going to happen to the gays there? Going to be thrown off the top of buildings and thrown in sacks into the Thames or something like that. But it's not so much that they love Islam, they hate Christianity. It's like the Herodians, the Pharisees, the scribes, and the Romans working together to crucify Christ. It's not that they had anything in common, but they hated Christ. So you could get such diverse groups as the scribes, the Pharisees, the Herodians, the Romans, all working together. Why? Because they hated Christ. And that's the common denominator in the West right now. Western governments hate Christianity. As Serge Trifkovic, in his Sword of the Prophet book, observes, the great Western powers, the heirs of those who had looted Constantinople in the Crusades, they were on a crusade once, the Fourth Crusade, and they didn't even bother to get to her land. They just stopped at Constantinople and looted Constantinople, helped weaken that great Byzantine Empire. They refused to help when the Turks were breaking through the walls of Constantinople with cannon that was built by a Hungarian Catholic. It's true, the Western powers provided the cannon with which the Turks conquered Constantinople, who forced the last emperors to forswear their Orthodox faith at the Council of Florence as the price for Western help, which never came. The same Western powers, and Great Britain in particular, who had actually supported the Turkish subjugation of Christian Europeans on the grounds that the Mohammedan Empire was a stabilizing force. Do you remember when Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State of Obama, said that the Muslim Brotherhood was a stabilizing force, a force for peace and moderation in the Middle East? The same people had murdered President Anwar Sadat of Egypt for making a treaty with Israel. And the Muslim Brotherhood then looted and destroyed 72 churches in one weekend in Egypt, and went on to behead vast amounts of Christians in Libya. And that's a Muslim Brotherhood, a stabilizing force, a force for peace and moderation. A counterweight against Austria and Russia is what Disraeli was saying. And so Britain's support for Turkey, which is scandalous, disgusting, and led to what we're facing right now. The scandalous alliance with Turkey against Russia in the Crimean War reflected a pernicious frame of mind. We don't use that word pernicious often enough today, but it's a good word. It has manifested itself more recently in overt, covert, or de facto support of certain Western powers for the Muslim side in Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Chechnya, Cyprus, Sudan, East Timor, and Kashmir. And that's true. This Eastern Orthodox Christian is pointing out something so true. Macron's France, Britain today, Biden and Obama's America, Clinton's America, they have continually gone on the Muslim side against Christians every single time, without exception. And there's a lot of incidents of Turkish atrocities, dreadful massacres of Christians, as was being documented. Not that this stopped British policy in supporting the Muslims against the Christians in the 1800s. So 160 years ago, Western powers interfered in the policies of Russia, invaded the Crimea, and as a result, strengthened the hand of radical Islam. And millions of Christians died as a result. Instead of supporting civilization and advancing freedom, which is the propaganda, like during the Second World War, it's for Western Christian civilization, for democracy, freedom. And then they betray the whole of Eastern Europe into the hands of Stalin and take millions of Russians and Ukrainians in Western Europe and through Operation Keelhaul, force them back at bayonet points into the hands of the NKVD, who murder most of them and make the rest slaves for the rest of their life in the Arctic hellholes of Siberia. So this treachery of the West towards Christians in the East is a pattern that's continued for a very long time. And the Crimean War is where we got the Iron Cross from, the Victoria Cross. The Victoria Cross came from Russian cannon captured at Sevastopol that were melted down, and that's where the Victoria Crosses of Queen Victoria comes from. It's from actual iron from Russian cannon from the Crimean War. And so the Victoria Cross, which is the greatest symbol of courage of the British, is also a symbol of treachery of the cursed politicians. They retarded civilization that unintentionally led to worse massacres of Christians in the extended life granted to tyrannical Turkish Empire. Turkish Empire would have ended a good 50, 60 years before 1915. And you wouldn't have had the genocide of the Armenians if the British and French had not supported Turkey in the Crimean War of the 1850s. The Turks slaughtered over 200,000 Armenian Christians in Bayazid in 1877, in Alashgurd in 1879, in Sashun in 1894, in Constantinople, 1896, in Adana in 1909, and Armenia from 1895 to 1896. Finally, in 1915, the Turks massacred over 1.5 million Armenian Christians in the most intensive extermination of Christians ever launched up to that point, which wouldn't have happened but for the Crimean War, which, yes, the Light Brigade was brave and there was the Thin Red Line and praise God for Florence Nightingale, but the policy was wrong. The wrong war at the wrong time and the wrong place and for the wrong side. Here's a photograph taken in 1913 of the Borough-governed monastery in Van. In May 1915, the Turkish army attacked, burned, and destroyed much of this monastery. And here's the gutted, abandoned interior of an Armenian monastery north of Diyarbakir in Turkey. Ottoman Armenians are marched by Turkish soldiers to a prison in Kayapert in Armenia in April 1915, the beginning of the genocide. They marched Christians into the desert where there was no food, no water, so they could starve to death in some cases. The Armenians were ordered by the authorities to gather in the main square of the city to be deported, and this crowd was massacred. So they always have false reasons to bring you together. Armenian deportees in Malatya who were massacred. Fokia in flames during the massacre perpetrated by Turkish forces June 1915. And these are some of the people taking part in the massacre of Christians. And photography, very disturbing. Even if people actually, imagine standing there to take pictures of Christians that you've lynched. In this case, Christian doctors hanged in Aleppo Square. You've heard of Aleppo, it's part of Syria today. It comes to the news regularly. But that these soldiers would stand posing with a picture of civilian doctors being hung. What kind of people do that? Christian woman crucified by Turks in Armenia and somebody took a picture. Just so disgusting. Corpses of Armenian Christians. Again, somebody took the pictures afterwards. Who would even want to record that? The American ambassador to Ottoman Turkey, Henry Morgenthau, sent this report. He later produced a book on it, speaking about the campaign of race extermination, saying nothing short of actual force, which obviously the United States are not in a position to assert, would adequately meet the situation. I suggest you inform belligerent nations and mission boards of this. In other words, America did nothing. And they were massacring Christians throughout the Ottoman Turkish Empire and in 1915, and the West did nothing. This is what the Kingdom of Armenia used to look like. It was a huge area. What today is eastern part of Turkey used to be the Kingdom of Armenia, a large area. And you can see that the Christian population of the Armenians is shown in the blue here, scattered throughout that area. And then we've got actual statistical reports of where the deportation routes were and where the main concentrations of the massacres took place. The Armenian genocide, there were main massacre areas, there were deportation areas, there were flight routes where people fled, there were deportation routes where they were wiped out. And this is well documented. They've got the numbers, the dates, the places, in some cases names and photographs. Documentation at the time of where the Armenians were being massacred, and the size of the red circles is indicating how many were massacred in these places. In one place in Van, the civilians realized what was happening and armed themselves to hold the line and try and defend themselves from the massacres. These are Russian troops, so the Russians took pictures where they came across what had obviously been a massacre, because Russia took a lot of what had been Armenia. And the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute has documentation like this where people uncovered mass graves and obvious evidence of massacres. And some of the skulls and bones are kept in a memorial chapel in Lebanon, reminding the Christians, sometimes pictures of the people who were victims of this. These are Armenian genocide survivors who fled to Jerusalem in 1918, and Jerusalem had fallen to the British, or been liberated by the British, if you want to put it that way, on 9th of December 1917. Lawrence of Arabia was part of all that too. And so these people could flee to somewhere where they would find sanctuary at that moment. Not that the British wouldn't abandon them later, but at least for that moment they had some safety. And here's, again, people who survived. In Passage to Ararat, it describes how on the road to Adana, Turkish women were given daggers to stab the dying Armenians in order to gain the credit in the eyes of Allah of having killed a Christian. We came across this in Sudan, where there were Saudi Arabian businessmen and so on who had come on tourism to the Nuba Mountains of Sudan, and sort of like you might have some Japanese or American big game hunter coming to South Africa and having a canned lion hunt where they're able to shoot some Boswell Wilkie retired lion who's never lived in the wild, and he's put out in some pasture area, and along comes this chap who dilutes himself after paying $5,000 or $20,000 and so on, and they shoot this poor retired lion and delude themselves that they're some kind of brave big hunter. And I mean, I've never seen a point of that. The only people I've hunted are people who can shoot back at me. I don't see the point of hunting some poor animal who, it's not a game if the other side doesn't know that they're in it, and if they don't have an equal opportunity to you. What's the game in that? But they literally had Saudi Arabians coming to Sudan and paying for the opportunity to crucify a Christian in Nuba Mountains, or to shoot them, or whip them, or stab them, or behead them. And this is actually a tourism thing that was going on in Sudan. So it's not like it's ended. In our country, we have these canned lion hunting expeditions. They do it in Zimbabwe too, I'm sorry to say. And of course, that got exposed when they shot a Cambridge study line. Cecil was that back in 2014. Cecil was collared and being followed by satellite. The next thing they knew that their lion had been shot, a very famous lion, Cecil. Most of these poor lions who get shot in these canned lion hunting don't have a name, but on this occasion, it led to a worldwide movement. I made Cecil's picture my Facebook profile picture for years, and we marched to Parliament protesting about canned lion hunting, and we got some legislation passed to restrict it, but I don't think it's wiped out yet. It's shocking, but imagine canned Christian hunting or canned Christian crucifying tourism. There's a market, and the people who pay for this. And this picture, these pictures taken of Christians murdered on the side of the road, the Red Cross published these pictures, and to try and alert people what was going on. In 1915 to 1916, over 100,000 Maronite Christians were murdered in Lebanon and Syria as well. And in this crevice in the earth near Kangas in Turkey, in 1915, an untold number of Armenians were thrown to their deaths down this pit or this crevice. Talat Pasha is one of the architects of the genocide. He said Turkey is taking advantage of the war, First World War, in order to thoroughly liquidate its internal foes, that is, the indigenous Christians. Indigenous indeed. The Christian Armenians had been there longer than the Turks, much longer than the Turks. The Turks made the Armenians a minority in their own country, without thereby being disturbed by foreign intervention. I don't think they needed to have worried, because even if there hadn't been a world war, I doubt if any of the Western powers had the backbone and guts to care for Christians in another land. They don't even care for the Christians in their own land. Mehmet Talat Pasha, Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire, was the chief architect of the Armenian genocide, and the American ambassador Henry Morgan identified Mehmet Talat, Ismail Enver, and Hamid Dejmal as the three main architects of the genocide in Armenia. It's no wonder that the British Prime Minister, Gladstone, described the Muslim Turks as they were, upon the whole, from the Black Day when they first entered Europe, the great one anti-human specimen of humanity. Wherever they went, a broad line of blood marked the track behind them, and as far as their domination reached, civilization disappeared from view. They represented everywhere government by force as opposed to government by law. And these were the kind of newspaper headlines at the time. Turks are slaughtering Christian Greeks. Not that the British government would do anything about it, or the Americans. Not satisfied with torture of Armenians, Turks extend cruelty to Greeks. Because after killing the Armenians, they went after the Assyrian Christians, and they went after the Greeks last. And the Greeks were deported from the coast to the interior. Why? Because on the coast they might escape, or the West might wake up and come and help evacuate them to safety. So better for them to be in the interior, harder for them to get support, or harder for them to flee. Massacres kept up. So newspaper headlines were like this: 40 Christians a day are dying, say refugees. 20,000 Christians killed or missing in Persia. Turks and Kurd slayers. Yeah, remember, it's not just the Christians, there's also sometimes Turks being murdered, because they didn't like the Kurds either. Thousands more in peril. So the newspaper headlines were there. Clergymen hanged, Assyrian men tied in groups of 5, put to death in cemetery. And even as the Ottoman Turkish Empire crumbled and was replaced by the new Republic of Turkey, at the end of the First World War, the Young Turks took over, internal coup. Kemal Atatürk, who became known as, Mustafa Kemal became known as Atatürk, or the father of Turkey. And he founded the modern state of Turkey. The ancient city of Smyrna, you've heard of Smyrna, it's in the Bible. This is where Polycarp was discipled by John. John was the apostle who actually was running the church in Smyrna. He was the bishop of Smyrna, and Polycarp was his disciple. Smyrna is one of the 7 churches of Revelation, a Christian civilization. 300,000 Christian population. It was destroyed in 1922. I mean, that's within the lifetime of my father. The burning of Smyrna, the massacre of its Christian population, marked the end of the Greek civilization in Asia Minor. Remember, for 1,000 years, the Byzantine Empire stood, Eastern Christian civilization. On the eve of its destruction, Smyrna was a bustling port. It was a vibrant commercial center. Its seafront promenade was a popular tourist destination. They probably called it the waterfront too. The quay of Smyrna was full of people during the fire, started by the Turkish army. And the Christian population on the Smyrna quay, September 1922. Smyrna massacre, Hellenic families crying for their relatives. And this was taken by the Red Cross. Chrysostomus was the top church leader in Smyrna. So on 9th of September 1922, a Turkish mob organized and mobilized by the Turkish army under the command of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk attacked the Greek metropolitan of the Orthodox Church, Chrysostomus. And he was lynched before the burning of Smyrna. The Muslim mob ripped his eyes out, dragged him by the beard. While he was bleeding through the streets, they were kicking and beating him. It's hard to imagine nobody has compassion on a man in that situation. Every now and then, when he had the strength to do it, he would raise his right hand and bless his persecutors, repeating, "Father, forgive them." The Turks became so infuriated that one cut off the metropolitan's hand with a sword, and Father Chrysostomus was hacked to pieces by the angry Muslim mob. And there were others who were murdered. This leader was buried alive. There's a book written on Paradise Lost, the destruction of Smyrna in 1922, the destruction of Islam's city of tolerance. For years, people pointed to Smyrna saying, look how tolerant the Muslims are. You've got this whole Christian city in Turkey. Yes, and it was destroyed in 1922. And the inhabitants were trapped between the flames on the one side and the Turkish bayonets on the other. So on the 13th of September 1922, the Turks burned Smyrna to the ground, the last Christian city in Asia. This isn't the birthplace of Christianity, remember. Incredibly, British, American, Italian, and French warships were anchored in the Smyrna harbor, and they were ordered to maintain neutrality. Some of the eyewitnesses described the scene. The pitiful throng huddled together, sometimes screaming for help, but mostly waiting in a silent panic beyond hope. They didn't budge for days. Typhoid reduced their numbers, but there was no way to dispose of the dead. Occasionally, a person would swim from the docks to one of the anchored ships and try to climb the ropes and chains, only to be driven off. On the American battleships, the musicians on board were ordered to play as loudly as they could to drown out the screams of the pleading swimmers. The British poured boiling water down on the unfortunates who reached their vessel. Can you imagine that any people could be that callous? The harbor was so clogged with corpses, the officers of the foreign battleships were often late to the dinner appointments on shore because bodies would get entangled in the propellers of their launches. A cluster of women's heads bound together like coconuts by their long hair floated down the river towards the harbor. This photo was taken by the Red Cross after the slaughter. The text inside indicates the photo was taken by representatives of the Red Cross in Smyrna. Over 1 million Hellenes, that's Greeks who lived in Asia, were forced to abandon their land and their homes. And so this is known as the Greek genocide. This was the end of Christianity in Turkey, which had always been Christian Byzantine Empire. As Trifkovic observes, at the very time that Europe achieved its military and geopolitical advantage, at the end of the Second World War, 1918, they'd beaten the Ottoman Turkish Empire, their troops were in Constantinople, they could have done what they wanted. Europe had achieved its advantage. The moral and religious decline that had culminated in the auto-genocides of 1914 and 1939 became evident. Having found in their grasp places their Crusader ancestors had only dreamed of reclaiming, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, the Western powers now controlled us. The French and the British troops were there. You know, what would their ancestors who had fought so hard to get these places liberated back during the Crusades, what would they have said? And an effete and demoralized European governments made no efforts to re-Christianize them, and within a few decades, neatly abandoned them. I think betrayed is a better word. The moral disarmament of contemporary post-Christian Europe is now nearly universal. Before the First World War, church attendance in Europe was 64%. Before the Second World War, church attendance was down to 40%. After the Second World War, church attendance in Europe sunk to 4%. And that's where it is in Britain right now, 4%. Germany's 5%, Portugal's 2%, Czech is 1%. The best church attendance in Europe, in Western Europe, is in Northern Ireland, and where it's about 40%. Switzerland's 14%. I mean, what a catastrophe. The only countries with good church attendance right now are Romania, Russia, and Ukraine. Europe has committed suicide with these stupid wars fighting against themselves. And now you've got the Christian Russians and the Christian Ukrainians fighting one another. And you know, the anti-Christians must be laughing. They've engineered it, yes, but we fall into their traps again and again. Europe has historically been Christendom. And all of Europe has got rich Christian heritage, and now mostly they've abandoned it, and they're going for paganism. And Britain, which used to send out missionaries, is now banning people from preaching the gospel. We've had friends of ours, like Adrian Clark, arrested for preaching open air in Bristol, which is where George Whitefield began his open air preaching. Can you imagine being arrested for open air preaching in Britain? It's insane. And in America, Britain, they've locked up people for praying on the sidewalk. Now, Lawrence of Arabia, who, by the way, you wouldn't pick it up from the film, but he was a dedicated Christian, and to the end of his days, even though he understood Islam, and here he is at the Versailles Treaty, at the Versailles Congress. There's Lawrence of Arabia, just slightly to the right and above Prince Faisal, who became King Faisal. And here's the Arab delegation coming to receive from the treaty what the British had promised. You fight against the Turkish Empire, we'll give you control of your countries. And they come to Versailles to find out, sorry, we already signed the Sykes-Picot Treaty Agreement. Syria is going to go to the French. Why does it go to the French? Well, they had to get something. And Britain's going to get the oil-rich Iraq and Kuwait and all this sort of thing. And they were all shocked and stunned. And Lawrence was so shocked at the betrayal. You know, he had been used by his government to lie to them, to promise them things. There's also the Balfour Declaration, where they're going to give the Jews Palestine and let them take over and create their own state of Israel there. And the Arabs are horrified. This isn't what we fought for. You lied to us. And Lawrence was so shocked and so disgusted that when King George V called him to Buckingham Palace to give him a knighthood and the highest awards for honor that the British government could give, he refused it out of protest that the British government had dealt treacherously with the Arabs. And he said that the Versailles Treaty guaranteed wars for the next generations his actual word was for the rest of the 20th century. I don't think you could see it would go into the 21st century, but the way they drew up the maps. And so he changed his name to Shaw, joined the Royal Air Force as a private. Now, he ended the First World War as a lieutenant colonel. He threw that away. He refused the knighthood and the highest awards from the British King. I think it even included a Victoria Cross. He was the most popular man in the British Empire. He's a celebrity in the world. He then became a private in Tank Corps and in the Air Force. And He died in 1935 in a motorbike accident. In fact, his motorbike accident might have saved my and many other people's lives because he was not wearing a helmet. He died as a result of head injuries. And so legislation came in mandating a motorbike helmet as a result. But evidence has now come out he was actually assassinated by the British intelligence. MI6 was very concerned about what he is up to. And there's a film out, you can actually look for it, Who Assassinated Lawrence of Arabia? And that's very convincing that, in fact, MI6 was heavily involved in this. And he was riding a motorbike, so they knew, and a black car came and knocked his vehicle, and his vehicle motorbike had black paint along one side. He had obviously been hit by a vehicle. But the man who saw this, the mechanic, was not allowed to testify at the inquest about it. They suppressed a lot of the evidence. The inquest was done in the morning, he was buried in the afternoon. And the evidence is the British government got rid of him because he is an embarrassment. He did not approve of what the British were doing in carving up the Middle East into different spheres of influence between the French and the British and betraying the Arabs. And he just saw this is just going to be war for the rest of the 20th century in the Middle East. The Middle East had been quite calm before. So Lawrence of Arabia's assassination is probably the first celebrity murder of the 20th century. And this vehicle accident was obviously so effective they did it again with General George Patton at the end of the Second World War. And who knows how many other celebrities were assassinated like that. You can see his God-honoring grave area. The Lord is my light, it declares in Latin, and it's got a scripture to honor of the Son of God on his gravestone. Where a friend of mine in England said he's been down this road and he can't see how Lawrence of Arabia, who knew his motorbike well and who knew this road very well, how he could possibly crash on this road. And there's only like 3 trees along the road, although in the Lawrence of Arabia film, they have it like it's tree-lined wall to wall. And he didn't die at the site. He died 6 days later in the hospital. And the MI6 was in the hospital. They had locked down the whole hospital, sworn everyone secrecy, put notices out. No newspaper could report on Lawrence of Arabia's motorbike accident. And the first the British public knew that he had had a motorbike accident was 6 days later when he died, when they released information about his death. So they were controlling the whole situation. When he came in from the accident, there's already the Secret Service at the hospital. And the amount of cover-ups and amount of lying at the inquest. And the other thing is, the inquest reports, the accident reports, all of those have gone missing. Now, governments don't lose documents that they want. They lose documents they don't want. You know, it's just extraordinary. It's like everything connected with General Patton's motor vehicle accident also disappeared. All of the records, everything, the accident reports, the whole lot, they're just gone. And that's what happened to Lawrence of Arabia's crash sites as well. Now, he wrote some phenomenal books, his insights to the revolt in the desert, and there probably was no Westerner who understood the Arabs better. He spoke the language, he was trusted by them, he was loved by them, and he was seen as a threat. Now, you've all seen probably Lawrence of Arabia film, which is good aside from the fictional motorbike accident at the beginning. They've got him coming where there's a cyclist coming against him, towards him, and that's not true. He was going the same direction as the cyclist. And they have him losing control because he comes over the horizon and suddenly sees a cyclist. In fact, he was coming down a long hill and he could see the cyclist in the distance going in the same direction as him. So they changed the direction, they changed all the facts in the film, and most people think it's gospel because they saw that version. There's another Lawrence film called Lawrence After Arabia, which is with Joseph Fiennes playing the part. And it's well worth seeing as well. It's his battle with the treacherous, cursed, backstabbing politicians at the Versailles Treaty. So I recommend that and try and find the video on who assassinated Lawrence of Arabia. Now, after World War I, with the installation of nominally pro-Western governments in many Muslim countries, fashioned from the wreckage of the Ottoman Empire, the West seemed to have convinced itself of the existence of a benign Islam. And so this is the state of the world. One part has all their face covered except their eyes, and in the West, we've got our eyes covered. And some things can't be covered by a burqa alone. And I think the reason why Muslims have moved from a headscarf to burqas is to cover up domestic violence, battering of women and so on. I'm sure that is the main reason for the burqas, because when I was converted, you saw Muslim women wearing headscarves in Cape Town, but you never saw people wearing burqas and face coverings. Hair coverings was what's required in the Quran, nothing about face coverings. So this is just because, well, some have acid thrown, noses cut off, black eyes and so on. Civilization can go backwards. And most civilizations understand that children should be protected from abuse. But in the name of diversity, it's okay for kids to bang swords on their heads, apparently. And then you import a whole lot of diversity who hate their host country so much they want to burn the flags that symbolize the countries that are giving them free everything, like in Sweden and Denmark and Norway and Germany and other countries that are foolish enough to bring in this Islamic invasion. And they disrespect, even on the 11th of November in Britain, the most holy day in the British calendar. When you remember the soldiers, they have their signs out there, British soldiers burn in hell, at remembrance services. Behead those who insult Islam. Europe, you will pay. Your 9/11 is on its way. Kill those who insult Islam. Freedom, go to hell. Be prepared for the real Holocaust. I mean, you can just see the tolerance. And it's a good thing that Islam is peaceful and tolerant. I mean, imagine if they were violent. And Islam is such a peaceful religion, they'll kill anyone who says it isn't so. Diversity means living with people who hate you. And, who want to kill you. Islam is a religion of peace and love, and we show that by rioting. Entire Christian communities were obliterated in the Middle East. The Nestorians, the Chaldeans, other Christian communities were virtually wiped out. As late as the 6th of September 1955, Istanbul's Christians suffered what was called the worst race riot in Europe, which in 7 hours destroyed and looted over 4,000 homes, 1,000 businesses, 73 churches, 3 monasteries, 23 schools. This is in one city. 110 hotels, 27 pharmacies. It caused over £100 million of damage to properties belonging to Christians in a 7-hour time period. And what led to it? Well, there was a bombing of the Turkish embassy in Salonika or Thessalonica. And it was discovered later it was an own goal false flag. The Turkish government bombed their own embassy to incite this anti-Greek violence. So they even desecrated the birthplace of the founder of modern Turkey, Mustafa Ataturk, to blame it on the Greeks for the purpose of inciting and justifying anti-Greek violence. Nearly 1,000 Greek shops, 4,000 homes sacked, plundered, 38 churches burned down, 34 more churches vandalized, 3 monasteries, the main Greek Orthodox cemeteries desecrated. This lethal pogrom, as they call it, the 6th to the 7th of September 1955, delivered the fatal blow to the Greek community and the Hellenism, or the Greek culture of Constantinople, in 7 hours. Remember, Constantinople was built by Greeks. It's an ancient Greek city. 70 years ago, the Greek minority in Istanbul was targeted by a crisis, carefully fabricated by the Turkish security service, one of the best documented false flags out there. There's a lot of false flags, but this is one of the more egregious ones. And all this destruction as an excuse to destroy Christian civilization in the capital they built. It's no wonder that William Muir, one of the greatest Oriental scholars of all times, he concluded at the end of his long and distinguished career, the sword of Muhammad and the Quran are the most fatal enemies of civilization, of liberty and truth, which the world has yet known. It is an unmitigated cultural disaster, parading as God's will. Here's the Sheikh of Islam of the Ottoman Empire declaring holy war jihad in the First World War. And of course they did who knows how much destruction in the Balkans, which today is still a very unstable part of Europe. Remember, the First World War started in the Balkans, in Sarajevo. And this is a place where Islam had rampaged for decades, for centuries actually. Well, in 2015, we did a lot to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the Syrian genocide, and this year it's the 110th anniversary. The persecution of Christians by Muslims and the genocide by Turkey have become forbidden subjects in Western circles. Well, for that matter, they don't talk about the attempted genocide of the Boers during the Anglo-Boer War much either, do they? So there's 1 year missing in Turkish history. It's like 1915 is just gone. And we need to complete the Ottoman Empire history by recognizing the genocide of 1915. And the Armenians are scattered all over the world, even a few hundred in South Africa. And then there's, Armenia is now just one little country in the Russian Federation. That's all that's left. And then there's Nagorno-Karabakh, which is attached to the side. And Nagorno-Karabakh has been fighting for years now to survive, surrounded by Azerbaijan, who's waging jihad against them. And Nagorno-Karabakh is an island of Christianity in the Sea of Islam, just like the Nuba Mountains is an island of Christianity in the Sea of Islam in Sudan. And this is, again, one of the front lines of Christianity where Christians are trying to stand. These are the last Armenians trying to stand in their own country, and they're in federation with Russia at the moment. Turkey is guilty of the Armenian genocide. And the first country to recognize the genocide was Cyprus, and there's a monument to the genocide in Cyprus. Here's a view of the Armenian memorial in the French city of Marseille, built during its 100th anniversary. And there still is an Armenian. By the way, Armenia is where the Ark of Noah ended. These were the original provinces of Armenia, but now there's only a few in existence, and that's under protection of Russia in the Caucasian Mountains. This is the monument to the Armenian genocide in the country of Armenia, which is part of the Russian Federation, in the Caucasian Mountains. This is not far from where the Ark of Noah would have rested. The mountains of Ararat are still there. And so this is the commemorative place, and in April, people come from all over the world to commemorate. They've got an eternal flame, and it was established before the 100th anniversary of the genocide. And the people come to the sacred flame and plant flowers around the side. Torchlight processions. It's so important that we don't forget our ancestors and that we care about our brothers and sisters in Christ. They've got a monument with as many pictures and artifacts as possible, and symbolizing the mother's fleeing with her baby. This is something that you just imagine what the history of the world would be like if this had not happened. And it wouldn't have happened if the British and French had not been involved in that stupid Crimean War on the wrong side, for the wrong allies. Who knows how much devastation is going to be caused in the future by dumb things being done in the world right now. Stupid, unnecessary wars like this Ukrainian war. There are a few countries that have recognized the Armenian genocide. America has not yet, or I trust it will under the new administration. But Turkey does everything they can to stop countries recognizing the genocide that took place in Turkey. Turkey, to this date, is in denial that it even happened. And so here we're on the 110th anniversary. I don't know how many people would recognize the Armenian flag, but that's the colors. Red, blue, and yellow. And so some people are using billboards and the internet in order to communicate. And there are commemoration events. Turkey's just saying it doesn't happen, and that's why we get angry when you mention it. You know, it's like abortion is good and there's nothing wrong with abortion. That's why we get angry when you show pictures of abortion. You know, that's the way it works. So we need to remember. There's some books out, like The History of the Armenian Genocide, with this quote, "They can live in the desert but nowhere else." That's a quote from the government. The Death March, an Armenian survivor's memoirs. The Young Turks and the boycott movement. Guilty with full charges for murdering over 2 million Assyrians and Armenians. Armenians at the twilight of the Ottoman era. Ambassador Morgenthau's story, the American ambassador's testimony of what he knew and documented. I swear by the spilt blood of my ancestors, I will never forgive, never forget 1915. That's a bit of a harsh title for a book, but you can understand why they think like that. So the Syrians, the Armenians, and the Greeks united against Turkey on 24th of April. 19th of May was selected by the Greek Parliament as a day to commemorate the Pontian Greek genocide by the Turks. So the Assyrians have 24th of April, and the Greeks have the 19th of May. Turkey is guilty. Armenia, the survival of a nation. Return of the churches. We need freedom of faith, protection of Christian rights, defense of religious freedom. Armenian history is not for sale. 14 centuries of religious discrimination and persecution, causing the suffering, oppression, enslavement, murder of over 270 million Christians, has been buried under thick whitewash of myths of Islamic tolerance. And this I documented in my Slavery, Terrorism, and Islam book. The deceit, the cowardice, the silence by all too many Western journalists and academics, all the news that's fit to print, the truth without fear or favor. I mean, how many times do these journalists pretend a standard that they don't have? They're cowards. This continues to facilitate religious discrimination and persecution by radical Islam to this day. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote, if we do not know our own history, we will simply have to endure all the same mistakes, sacrifices, and absurdities all over again. And we live in South Africa, in a country where there are people trying to incite a new genocide. You can tell when a genocide's coming. First, they dehumanize their targets. Then they demonize their targets. Then they disarm their targets. And then they kill them all. That's what happened in Rwanda. That's what happened up in Armenia and Turkey. And we've got Plasmorder monument outside Pretoria to commemorate the thousands of white Afrikaans South African farmers, commercial farmers, who've been targeted, tortured in many cases, and their family members. While we've got a government that says, kill the Boer, kill the farmer is not hate speech, and it's just a struggle song. No, really and truly. How many times must this happen? When you start to demonize and dehumanize a group of people, and then you want to disarm them, that's all the red flags you need. And then one should be alert. The intellectual dishonesty of those Westerners who engage in academic gymnastics to justify the invasion of other people's lands, the looting, pillaging, raping, murdering, enslaving of whole peoples, this needs to be exposed. It's hypocritical. The hypocrisy of those who justify the military expansion of Muslims, but condemn those like the Crusaders who inflicted defeats on these Islamic invaders, this needs to be challenged. It's double standards. The fiction that jihad has never been an offensive or aggressive concept, but only defensive, needs to be dismissed with the contempt such deception deserves. I've stood up in debates and said, what were Saudi Arabians defending in Spain? Look at the map. There's a big gap between Saudi Arabia and Spain. How can jihad be defensive? Because Spain is not bordering on Saudi Arabia. I mean, this is nonsense. Jihad's only defensive. Well, they took a lot of territory all over North Africa, wiping out churches at every step, and then all the way through the Middle East, and then all the way through Southern Europe, and they think that we're going to accept that jihad's only defensive? How can one be that stupid? When Islam defines a refusal to submit to Sharia law under Islam as aggression, when they define peace as submission to Islam, you must know you're not talking the same language. So that's how jihad can always be defensive, because if you refuse to submit to Islam, then you're being aggressive. And then they've got the right to attack you. Jihad seeks to conquer our souls and seeks the disappearance of our freedoms and our civilizations. Jihad seeks to annihilate our way of living and our way of dying, our way of praying or not praying, our way of eating and drinking and dressing, how we entertain ourselves, how we inform ourselves. It wants to annihilate our entire culture, actually. You don't understand, or you don't want to understand, that if we don't oppose them, if we don't defend ourselves, if we don't fight, then jihad will win. If we don't resist, genocide will happen again. It will destroy the world that, for better or worse, we've managed to build. It'll destroy our culture, destroy our art, destroy our sciences, destroy our morals, our values, our pleasures. Constantinople was once the most civilized city in the world. And to think now, Christians have been exterminated from Turkey. Do you know the Turks are now the biggest unreached people group in the world, according to Operation World? The Turks. What used to be the Christian Byzantine Empire, which used to be the heartland of Christianity, where all 7 churches of the book of Revelation were based. Jesus said, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And that's why I wrote the book, Slavery, Terrorism, Islam, the historical roots and contemporary threat. What I've given today is one of the chapters in the book. It's vital that we learn the lessons of history, stand up for religious freedom, speak out for freedom of conscience, expose the enemies of liberty, and fight the good fight of faith. It's not good enough to say, well, I've never been to Armenia, or I've never been to the mountains of Ararat. It doesn't matter. They're still part of the same body of Christ. And if we don't stand up for religious freedom there, then it'll be us who have to fight for it. But all the darkness cannot put out the smallest light. One candle is more powerful than darkness, because all the darkness can't put out a single candle. Remember the persecuted. They may destroy our churches, but they can never destroy our faith. This postcard comes from our friends in Egypt. Remember the prisoners as if chained with them, those who are mistreated, since you yourselves are in the body also. That's our theme for the International Day of Prayer for the Persecuted. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted. He saves those whose spirits have been crushed. We need to care for the persecuted. And so 2 Thessalonians 3, 1-2. Finally, brethren, pray for us, that the word of the Lord may run swiftly and be glorified, just as it is with you, and that we may be delivered from unreasonable and wicked men, for not all have faith. So we should be praying for the Christians in Syria, in Russia, and Ukraine. We will always be putting up our videos like this on our frontlinemissionsa.org website.